Oh, and welcome to this video. My name is Matt Petrowski. I'm guessing you're here to learn more about FileMaker. Great if you are. In today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the relationship graph. You really need to understand that in order to make the most of FileMaker. So hang with me and we'll be on my desktop in just a few. All right, so what are we learning today? Well, we're going to be taking a look at FileMaker's relationship graph, and you really need to make the most out of the relationship graph because when I think about FileMaker, I boil it down to primarily two areas when you're developing: creating your scripts and working in the graph. You are creating your structure, but once you've built your structure, which is basically all of your tables and your fields, then that's where you're going to need to wire them up. And understanding the relationship graph, how it works and how to organize it, pays big dividends. So if you'd like to follow along, we are going to use this option. Now I'm using a copy of FileMaker 16 as I'm going through this series, but really what I'm showing you here, a lot of things don't change in FileMaker. Just new features get added here and there. The graph has been the same pretty much ever since FileMaker 7 actually came out. They have not changed the graph. So everything you learn in this video will probably apply to all versions going back to really early and then also future versions until they change it. So we're going to choose this option right here actually, let's choose the Get Started one. I always tend to make a mistake there with that one. I am going to be using the Get Started because I'm going to be using the invoicing solution. So when this window comes up, I'm going to scroll down, or you can scroll down. And again, I'm here in FileMaker 16. I'm going to choose this option of Explore the Possibilities, See Advanced Solutions. Now, if you're in FileMaker 15 or 14, you're probably going to see this window that we have on screen right here, and ultimately we're wanting to pick this option of Invoices. That's what I'm going to use as my example, but regardless, if you don't load this solution, you're still going to learn a lot from this video. Now, I already have mine loaded here in my copy of FileMaker. I'm just going to show those windows. Now, I have two copies of the same database. I have one that I am working on, which is the normal one that I am just leaving it called Invoices. And then I also have another, which is Invoices Original. So we're going to compare what FileMaker has when it provides the file, and then also what I've done in terms of rearranging things and going through the graph in terms of working with it. So let's open up the Define database, the Manage database, and we're on the Relationships tab right there. And this is what FileMaker initially creates. Now, if you have not worked with FileMaker before, then quite simply, each one of these items are called table occurrences. And a table occurrence is nothing more than a reference to the underlying table. So when we select on Invoices right here, quite clearly, as it's named, it probably ties to this particular table of invoices in the tables. Now, our tables are what's known as canonical. In other words, they are authoritative, they're unique, and we're not going to have multiple. Yes, we could create multiple invoices tables, but it would never make sense to do that because we want one place to store all invoices. That's not the case with the relationship graph. The relationship graph allows us to have multiple table occurrences, and the problem that we come across in the relationship graph is the management of all of those table occurrences. Likewise, a table occurrence, it's very easy to confuse yourself because it can be named whatever you want. I can create a duplicate, which I'm doing by clicking on the table occurrence, which we can see becomes highlighted when you select it. I'm holding the Option key, and on Windows, it's probably the Control key. But as I double click, you can see that we can specify whatever table this table occurrence points to. We can also name it whatever we want, which allows us to confuse ourselves enormously in a solution that grows quite significantly. Now, I have a personal preference with regards to how I name things, but we can see just by looking at FileMaker's graph here that they are, for example, using this pipe character that we can see right here in terms of their naming. So they're calling it All Customers Pipe Popover. That, to me, coming into this graph, is completely non-descriptive. I don't know exactly what it connects to. I'm going to guess that it connects to customers because they've used the word customers within the actual table occurrence name. So this requires me to double click it to actually go look. Yeah, it is connected to customers. That is the case. Now, if you do not want to have to connect to double click on table occurrences, please don't name them something that is non-descriptive, whatever we want. There's also another feature that we come across when we're going to be naming our table occurrences in FileMaker, and that is the fact that when you're making selections in the rest of FileMaker, that could be within the layouts or it could be within your scripts, when you're coding things, FileMaker provides these dialogues that come up, and those dialogues have an alphabetical list of things. So if we know that that's going to be the case, we can sort of take advantage of it in order to do so. Now, one of the things that I used to do was I used to just follow a simple convention of naming my tables where I would put the name of the base table first, and then I would put whatever it does afterwards. For example, customers connected to invoices. Now, that's very descriptive when it comes to naming of this particular table occurrence. But what I found out is because of the fact that FileMaker in the rest of its interface sorts things alphabetical, it actually became a little bit easier to make sure and use the base table name as the second part of my equation and take advantage of using the prefix first. Because if I use a prefix first, it allows me to group things together, but there's also one other benefit that we get. If I was to name this table occurrence customers connected to invoices, when it's referenced in the rest of FileMaker, what happens is you get these double colons, which is our separator in terms of FileMaker that separates the table occurrence name that's pointing to the table, and then you have your field name. Now, what happens is we get a really big disconnect here where I have to look and read this as customers field name. Now, watch what happens when we switch this around and we say something like list of invoices, customer, field name. And then if we were to use the same character that FileMaker is using here, which is the pipe, we get a little bit more of a distinction. Now, I happen to like to use this little character. It's a double chevron. And on the Macintosh, you actually access that with the Option Shift and then the pipe character in order to inject that. Now, I just read this as the way that I design my FileMaker systems when I'm coding, when I'm naming these table occurrences. This is my area of interest. Then, trailing, I have my base table name. I always use the exact same base table name. In fact, customers and customer is not correct here. It would actually be customers, plural. I always want this to be exactly the same because when I'm referencing a field, I want to know where that field is coming from. What table is it originating from? It makes it much easier to understand. Then this prefix gives me the context in which I'm working. So that's just how I prefer to name things. But regardless of how you choose to name it, the key is name it so that it's going to make sense down the road. So let's get rid of that particular table occurrence and let's learn about the organization of the graph. Now, there are many different ways to organize the graph, and once you get into FileMaker pretty heavily, you start to find all kinds of different theories. In fact, I think Ray Colligan, not to make light of it, came up with 12 different approaches of ways to structure your graph. Here is the key thing to remember about this whole dialogue that we have right here. This is nothing more than your perspective of how you want to implement the functionality within your FileMaker solution. There's one key word that we need to know that exists in the rest of the database world. That's Entity Relationship Diagram, or ERD. An ERD basically says, how is my data going to be structured so that it makes sense? In this file that we have right here, the ERD is actually this table occurrence, this one, and this one. That's the core of this solution. It is basically we have invoices, we're going to have invoice data or line items, and of course those line items are coming from products. This more or less is the ERD. And we're going to learn about relationships where this is an equijoin, but then we have all these other types of relationships, and we'll do that in another video. But the organization of this graph right here is not immediately obvious. It's a little bit chaotic because we don't have a flow. Invoices is not, depending on what direction your language reads, from left to right or right to left. I'm in the US, so we read from left to right. There's a big disconnect here in terms of how this graph is organized. Now, all of these table occurrences, these are pretty much created for the purpose of functionality. They aren't essential to the structure of my data. They're essential to the usefulness of the actual application. So where they exist really doesn't matter. They can be somewhere else. So in the world of FileMaker, what we have is we typically have a situation where table occurrences are arranged in an order what's called anchor buoy. Now, I can't go into super great depth about all of the different graph strategies, but in essence, the approach of anchor buoy takes the mindset that we need to understand what's going on in our graph. So in order to do that, we put all of our primary table occurrences over on the left-hand side. They become the anchors. Those anchors, in turn, are basically the only table occurrences that are tied to a layout. Now, one thing we have to remember about the graph. In all of FileMaker, any one of these table occurrences can serve as the reference for a layout. Meaning that layout, if I have a layout based on this invoice data, its perspective is it can see the line items from invoices, but it could also see the product information. Now, a layout based on the invoices, that can see all of the invoice data, but it can only see the product information in context of those line items that have been added to that particular invoice. So think about it this way. Invoice number 1, it can only see 2 products provided those 2 products have been added to the line items. Invoice number B, another invoice, can see maybe 2 different products. So those 2 different invoices can see, they have 2 different perspectives of the data. Same thing applies to all of the rest of your table occurrences. Now in anchor buoy, typically it's a rule that you sort of go by that I will only ever have a layout based on table occurrences that are within this theoretical column. So right there, as I make that highlight, this is what makes your organization really nice when you're going to organize your graph. Do things in columns. So that would be a column. This would become a column. This would become a column. It's much easier to make sense out of the graph. So let's switch over to my file and take a look at what I've done over there. All right, I have rearranged things so that they're really not that easy to follow. It is very easy to organize this graph. Now, what I do is typically with my developer tables, which you can reference a previous video in this series, these are all put up in the upper corner. Then I tend to have my anchors. Now, I don't follow an exact anchor buoy. Now, pure anchor buoy means that only table occurrences or only layouts, would exist within table occurrences that are in the first column. All other table occurrences, those would basically be just for data reference. I buy into the bidirectional nature of FileMaker, meaning if it warrants it, I'm more than happy to create a table, a layout based off of a table occurrence in the rest of all of my table occurrences. You'll also hear the word of a squid, where this looks like a squid, where this is the head of the squid and things flow out. So let's get this organized. My values will come into this primary column right here, and I will put those values right there. So I'm going to select all of those table occurrences, and then I'm going to choose the arrange options that we have down here, where we can choose align left, center, right edges, and then we also have, right next to it, top, center, and bottom edges. Use these a lot in order to manage your graph. You can also use this one right here to distribute horizontally and distribute vertically. It makes it really nice because spacing within your graph Just like the way that words are spaced within a book, where you've got indents, they mean something, the amount of space between lines means something, punctuations help you decide when to take a pause, when to stop, what somebody else is saying when it's surrounded in quotes. Same thing applies to your graph. Although you're not going to be using punctuation, you're going to be using white space. So let's get things aligned here. So we're going to move all of these, and we're going to put them all within a column. Now I can first select all of those and then align them to their left edges. And then the distance that you use between the graph is just one based on comfort. Typically you want to give yourself enough comfort that you can actually move it away so that you can still work with it. There is also the opportunity to collapse or expand these. Now I've seen both different ways used. I happen to use the in-between state. So let's look at all of the three states. When we look at the table occurrence itself, we've got the little widget right here. We can collapse it entirely, which now requires us to actually double-click on the relationship in order to know what field is actually connected. So we double-click and we can see, oh, it's connected to ID invoices, a foreign key. Or we can expand it fully, which shows us all of the key values that are connected according to that table occurrence, plus the fields that we can choose from. Or the intermediate stage, so one is collapsed entirely, one is expanded entirely, we can look at it in the keys only stage. So now we're just looking at just the keys. Now I've asked for this from FileMaker for years and years. The graph basically needs an overhaul. And it would be nice if we had an information box at the bottom that always persisted, that told us things about relationships between two table occurrences. For example, I don't know if this table occurrence allows the creation of records, if it's got a cascading delete turned on, if sort is turned on. There are performance impacts based on those settings, in particular sorting, that we'd like to know about, but we really don't have that. The only thing we do have is when you hover over this little arrow. So the little arrow up in the top tells us what is the source table. So if you remember that table that I had named whatever you want, well, that forces me to actually hover over this arrow, look at what the source table is. I can say right there that line items is connected to line items. Very easy to make sense. What is the data source? Data source would be different if it was a file outside of this file. That's when you're connecting multiple FileMaker files together, the data source would change. And then finally, file access protection, not enabled, is the setting that we have in the security settings. Go back to the security video and take a look at that. It's a little checkbox that is not checked by default that you typically want to turn on in the security area in the final and last tab called File Access. All right. So we understand that about the graph, and now what we can do is we can put these relative to their use. So you notice that what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these pretty close to each other, and I'm now going to choose this option down here to distribute vertically. I'll align those left so that I've got equal spacing between all of them. I'm going to try to get the same spacing right here between these. I don't really need to use vertical on those. I'll select left edges here. So now we've got our second column. And then I'm going to have my third, my fourth, and so on. Typically, unless you've got a really complex database, most solutions, once you get to 5 levels deep, you really have a pretty complex FileMaker solution. And sometimes you want to rethink your strategy in terms of how many levels deep does this particular table occurrence need to see. And when I'm referring to levels of deep, that's from a point of origin, which in this case, the point of origin would be a user's on a layout. That layout is tied to invoices. An invoice needs some type of information that's 4 levels deep, and that would be first level, third level, or I read this as 4 levels. So that starts with the first one. The first one, maybe you read this differently, where the first table away is the first level. So this would be 3 levels deep to some developers. For me, I actually think of it as 4 levels deep. So it really depends on whether you think from a zero-based principle or a, counting off starting at 1. All right. So we've got this organization now where we've got white space in between all of our table occurrences. It makes it much easier. Now let's talk about what happens there's one thing in particular, and that is all of these different items and the field order. This is a very key thing. In the environment section of this series, when we go all the way back when we were learning about FileMaker's manage database and manage fields, we took a look at one feature in particular, and that is when we're in our fields, we have this option right here of view by, and then we have creation order, name, field type, and custom order. Now, it's very important that you make a selection that you want to use before you upload a file to FileMaker Server, because once you upload that setting, the file with that setting, for example, if I set it to custom order and then I now upload this file, that is perpetually going to be the case every time that I come into the graph, and forces me to reset it. So if I close the file down and reopen the file, when I come into the graph, the order will be custom order. Let's take a look at what the impact is to our relationship graph. Very key here. Notice that the order of my fields changes the way that connections are shown within the graph. So that can be a very big impact if you design something with a custom order and then you ultimately want to see it in the field name order, and you have arranged and organized all of your table occurrences according to that ordering. Everything becomes a wire mess where everything is now disjointed. So it's very important that before you start to arrange your graph, make sure that in your fields you have chosen the order that you want to use. I typically prefer field name order. That's going to give us the alignment and the arrangement that we make consistent with the naming that we've chosen for our fields, such as what I've suggested here in a previous video of ID, ID foreign table, ID foreign table. Groups them all together, very concise and very easy to keep organized. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the options that we have. That's graph organization, but we have a lot of tools available to us. Down here at the bottom, we basically have all of our add, our duplicates, our add relationship, editing, and notes. For me as a developer, these are all convenience buttons because really there isn't much of anything that you can't do in the graph where you absolutely need these buttons. So for example, values. If I wanted another one, sure, I could come down here and I could click the duplicate button. And there I have my duplicate. But I don't want to have to go all the way down here and mouse travel in order to click delete in order to get this prompt so that I can actually remove the table and remove it. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to just hold down the option key and just take a copy of a relationship or a table occurrence really quickly. If I want to get rid of it, I can hit the delete key, get the same dialog. If I don't want the dialog and I know I feel comfortable as an advanced developer, hold down that option key, and it's just gone. You've forcibly deleted that dialog. So that's a good way to go about the graph. So duplicating, really easy. You can use that option key. Editing, you don't need to go down here and click this little pencil icon in order to get this dialog right here. All you have to do is just simply double click and it will bring the same dialog up. Remember, escape key will automatically trigger that cancel if you just needed to look at something and get out of it. So we don't need those really down at the bottom. The arrange, we do use those a lot. We also have the ability to color table occurrences. Now, I always make this suggestion. There's many different ways to use color, but there are some ways that color users, for example, these two table occurrences are based off of the same base table, values. Now, some developers will come in and they will start to color all values table a specific color. Let's say in this case, red. That is one way to go about using color. You can use color to indicate the classification or where a table belongs, but FileMaker actually provides a tool for us that already does that. My preferred method of using color is to actually use color in order to designate functional use within a FileMaker database. So, for example, I use colors by choosing a row across And then I use those colors. There's a fair amount of them. You can, of course, use all the other different colors. But by picking a row, and I pick right in the middle, I designate what those colors actually mean in context of my FileMaker solution. So, for example, in the case of values here, anything that's going to be based off of value lists, for me, is designated as orange. Likewise, any table occurrence that is in my user interface or in all of my layouts tied to an actual layout, that gets a particular color. So for me, that is within the same row is this blue right here, actually this turquoise. Further on, any related table that is not necessarily a layout but is used for the purpose of a portal, in this case, that would be line items, that gets its own color. So here, that would become probably something, I think I've used purple in the past. Or no, actually, let me switch this back. The color, once you get used to it, becomes immediate. Purple for me is, I switched the two here while I was explaining this. Purple for me is a layout, and then blue is a portal. So you can sort of start to see that I'm using color now in order to give myself a frame of reference of how the rest of my FileMaker solution is working when I come into the graph. Immediately, once you create the association with whatever colors you're going to use, I can see, oh, okay, invoices is a layout. I know the user's interacting with that. On that layout, I know that they are interacting with this particular data because this represents a portal. And it becomes much easier to understand your whole FileMaker solution if you use colors in some functional way. My preference, actually saying, what's the area of use within FileMaker? Other developers, I want to see all tables that are the same color. Now, I mentioned that FileMaker provides us with a tool in order to see all of the same tables. Whenever we have one table selected, and we want to know on the graph all other tables that are that same table, that are based on the same underlying base table, FileMaker provides these tools right down here. Now, these tools are pretty helpful for zooming in and out of the graph. I don't need to explain those. This one is automatically going to adjust the whole window to contain all of the table occurrences, which can get really small. Basically, all it's doing is it's adjusting the percentage right here. But here's the menu option that we like to have when we want to see on the graph all of the table occurrences that are based on the same base table. It's right here, and it is that right there, select tables with the same source table, and it's Command U. I personally have not used this one very much. Select related tables one away. And that's mostly because my graph organization, by putting things into these columns, usually means that I can always see the tables that are one away. But we can take a look at these. With this selected, if I do that Command Y, what it's going to do is it's going to select all of these table occurrences that we can see that are connected. Notice that products, even though it's in the second column, did not get selected. And it's basically selecting them. Now, one of the downsides to FileMaker's selection is it doesn't invert these. My opinion would be they should do a much more significant graphic change. But what they do is they use the highlight color as specified of the operating system, at least here on the Macintosh. And on Windows, I don't even know what they use. Now, if you have a faint color that you use here, you really can't tell when you're zoomed out far. What do I mean by far? Well, if this graph was zoomed out, the colors that I've chosen to use on my table occurrences may make it look like I really can't see that too well. So it forces me to actually have to zoom in or click this in order to fit the graph to the size. Or if I want to just get back to the normal 100% view, I can type in 100%, hit Tab, and it will go to that. Now, the option that we have right there, that other option when we select a table occurrence and we want to see all other table occurrences using that Command U, that shows me on my graph right now, I can see as they became highlighted that I have two of them. I have this one right here and I have that one right there. Only two table occurrences. Useful when you're hunting for a table occurrence. And finally, the last thing that we have in the graph before we wrap things up and go to our questions about the graph, and I'll probably give you a few more pointers too, is down here, pages. Now, when you're working with another developer or another team of developers and you need to make sense out of a graph, or you want somebody to explain things, or you want to mark up a graph, let's say using a diagramming package where you can draw arrows and put in text and notes and information outside of FileMaker, this is where the pages and printing actually comes in handy. When I click on this little icon right there, it shows the actual pages. But remember, a PDF, because it's digitally output, really does not limit you to the physical constraints of a printed page. So I always click on this little option right here to show the page setup if I'm going to output. And then I'll choose some type of page setup like tabloid, something much bigger, and I'll change the orientation and click OK. And there we get much larger pages. Now, ultimately, if you're going to output as a PDF, that really doesn't matter, because when we click the print button, what we're going to get is we're going to get a dialog that actually tells us, do we want to print the graph on one page, or do we want to print the graph on multiple pages? So the multiple pages will apply if we're going to physical media. Otherwise, we could just print the graph on one page. Now, what this will do is it will shrink the graph, especially if it's a very large graph, down onto one page so that things are ultimately micro, itty bitty, and tiny. So it's ultimately worthless if your graph is super big. So we ultimately end up having to choose print graph on multiple pages if we have a very large graph. And when we continue, we basically get on all of our different pages all of the different 100% view of the graph. We can see that I'm actually hanging over. I didn't actually check to see what was going on. But of course, doing a PDF, it'd be just a matter here on the Macintosh of printing to a PDF, saving it as a PDF how I want, and then being able to give that to somebody else. And on Windows, you'll probably have to have a PDF driver installed in order to output that. But it is helpful on the graph. So here are my final closing tips for using and understanding the graph. And we're going to be spending a lot of time in the graph understanding relationships, the impacts of settings on relationships, and basically structuring our data. But first, we need to know how to be organized. We have down here in the tools where the arrow is very obvious, my selection tool, plus, minus, you get that, but we didn't go over this one right here. The note tool is very handy, and let's take a look at how notes can be used. First off, you simply just start, you drag, and then you have your note. Now what we get as options for our note is we get the ability to put whatever we want as notes, but likewise, we can choose and change fonts and sizes. Now this is where FileMaker's graph is lacking in terms of giving us information about our table occurrences, not just visually where we're able to see what is the relationship allowing creation. Is it deleting records when we delete a parent record? Since we don't have that, we can actually put that within notes, or we can use notes themselves in order to indicate things on the graph. So for example, if I'm going to make a header, let's say I like Helvetica New, and I'm going to make it 24 points, and I'm going to choose a particular color for headers. Now what do I mean by headers? And we're going to need to make the text white right here and say OK. Headers are basically your ability to use notes in order to demarcate areas of logical divisions within your graph. So what we can do is we can drag this out and we can put this up at the top, and this connection of table occurrences can be very much identified by this header note. Likewise, we can move our items down, and if you don't want to have to mess with choosing that realignment again, note that you can hold down the Option key on the Macintosh here, use your arrow keys, which is what I'm doing, in order to arrow these up and down without them shifting left and right while I would drag them. So I can arrow them down until they move out of range, and then I can hold down that Option key again and simply just make another copy of my header. So I can call these whatever I want, such as Invoices section. And then this could be called Customers section. Really, it is whatever you want to do in terms of your organization. So now this gives us a clue that we can actually use these for the purpose of creating a legend. So this is something else that I do within my graph, where I will make a note like this, and I will start to create a legend. So my legend looks like this. I will simply put in the word layouts, And then for this, I will simply put in the word portals. What am I missing now? Well, all I'm missing is choosing the same color that identifies each of the areas where I've used color. So for layouts, I just switch the background color to that same middle row that I use right there in the middle. Perfect. And for portals, I'm going to use a background color that is that blue. And there we go. What I end up using is notes for the purpose of actually creating a legend so that when I come into my graph, I can see how I've used color in order to identify things. One final thing about notes. Notes will not stay on top of table occurrences. They will float behind table occurrences. So if I'm going to use this as just a generalized note, where I'm going to double click and then let's say maybe make the background yellow, yet again, change my text to a nice little gray and resize down to a smaller point so it's distinguished from my header. This is an informational note. So if I'm going to give myself notes, which I highly suggest you do when you're developing, and try to keep them within your columns as well. So I would tend to select this, align to the left, and then use my resize options right here to resize to the smallest or the largest width. These are the two most that I use. I don't use as many of the other options. But now I've put my note in line with my column. Note that this note, that's pretty funny, can actually be dragged so that it floats behind. And all notes will be behind a different group of table occurrences. So if it makes sense and you want a note to actually stand out, you can actually identify groups of table occurrences in order to say what they provide. These provide such and such, such and such, can't talk and type the same functionality, but you get the idea. So I can give myself a note, and that note can be relative to the table occurrences, or it can surround the table occurrences. It's just a matter of personal preference, and you, of course, can give it as much of a boundary as you want. But with these items, it allows you to make much more sense out of your graph as you develop your FileMaker solution. And I highly suggest you pick some standards. If these don't work for you, establish what will work for you and continue to use them because it'll make it much easier for you to actually organize your graph. All right, so we're at 36 minutes and I only like 30 minutes of FileMaker functionality. We're going to get to our questions for today's video. For those that are live, let me switch over to my video chat. See if anybody had any questions. If not, we'll be giving it a quick little wrap. And there we go. All right. Morning, Lee. Hey, HBH group. A lot of the regulars checking in. Connection broken. Sorry about that, Oscar. All right. Great series. And another thing, FMI should bake into the program a tab in Manage Database where one can diagram the ERD versus using a layout or even a different program to do that. Yeah. You know, the debate about FileMaker and an ERD versus a the relationship graph, I've sort of come to find that the relationship graph, if you get rid of your notion that I need to have a separate ERD, the true structure of data, and I can use the relationship graph and the somewhat minimal amount of tools that FileMaker gives us for organization, it is pretty easy to actually organize your graph so that you can visually see the ERD and name your table occurrences such that all of the rest of the functionality that you bake into the graph is sort of separate. As a FileMaker learner, if you are learning FileMaker, the key thing to understand is that FileMaker's graph, it will grow, it will get bigger, it will become a mess, and that's mostly because it does not represent just the distinct data structure. It represents the data structure and the use, how users actually use your FileMaker database when you are developing. And that sort of, you'll get that over time. You'll sort of figure out, hey, I'm adding a table occurrence for functionality. It's not because that's how the data needs to be wired up. And you end up adding a few more of those than you do the actual structure. But if you organize well, it's not that bad. All right, so I think that's going to leave us with a close for today's video since we didn't have any questions about the graph specifically. If you are watching this as part of the replay, then go ahead, put your questions down below if you have a question related to the graph. I think I've covered everything in the tools. That's probably going to give us a good wrap for today. All right, so let's get that music going. Switch over to the subscribe there, and if you are interested, you can always subscribe here on YouTube. You can also subscribe over at my website, FileMaker Magazine, and the next video in this series will be popping up right here. Thank you for your time. I hope you've learned more about FileMaker. Much luck and happy file making.